A millionaire pretends to sleep to test his shy maid and freezes when he sees what she does to him. He thought she might curse him or steal from him. But instead, what she whispers changes everything. A lonely man. A quiet maid. And a secret so powerful, it shatters his world in an instant. Because when a little boy shows up at the mansion, clutching his hand and whispering, "Mommy says you're my daddy," the truth explodes like a bomb dot now. Torn between the ghost of his past and the family he never knew he had, he must face the one question that could save or destroy everything. Will pride and fear tear them apart forever? Or will love and forgiveness give them all a second chance? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today if you enjoy stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Harlow Manor, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Ethan Harlow's eyes fluttered open at precisely 6:30 in the morning, just as they had every day for the past 40 years. At 62 years old, his routines were as predictable as the sunrise itself. The king-sized bed felt too large, too empty. Margaret's side hadn't been slept in for 3 years, but he still couldn't bring himself to sleep in the middle. He ran his hand over the cool sheets beside him, remembering how she used to curl up there, her gentle breathing a lullaby that had helped him sleep for 35 years of marriage. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as he made his way downstairs to the kitchen. The mansion, with its 12 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms, felt more like a museum than a home these days. Every surface gleamed with perfection, but the silence was deafening. At the kitchen table, he poured himself a bowl of plain oatmeal, adding a measured spoonful of honey, just as Margaret used to prepare it for him. His gaze drifted to the silver-framed photograph on the counter. Margaret's smile beamed back at him, her eyes twinkling with the joy she'd always carried. The picture had been taken on their 30th anniversary, just 5 years before the cancer took her. "Good morning, my dear," he whispered to the photograph, a daily ritual that made the silence a little more bearable. The morning paper arrived with a soft thud against the front door. But before Ethan could rise to retrieve it, Mrs. Patterson, his housekeeper of 20 years, placed it beside his bowl. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron. "Mr. Harlow," she began, her voice wavering, "I need to speak with you about something important." Ethan's heart sank as Mrs. Patterson announced her retirement. Her arthritis had gotten worse, she explained, and her grandchildren in Florida needed her. He nodded understanding, though inside he felt another piece of his carefully ordered world crumbling. The employment agency sent Clara Matthews the following week. At 35, she was younger than Ethan expected, with mousy brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and clothes that had seen better days. She moved through the house like a shadow, dusting and cleaning with quiet efficiency. "The silver needs polishing weekly," he explained during her orientation. "And the windows, twice a month, inside and out," she finished softly, her eyes never quite meeting his. "The agency provided your requirements, Mr. Harlow." Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself watching Clara when she thought no one was looking. She arrived early every morning, dark circles under her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Her lunch breaks were spent making quiet phone calls in the garden, her voice tight with worry about payment schedules and late fees. Their interactions remained cordial but minimal. "Good morning, Mr. Harlow." "Thank you, Mr. Harlow." "Will that be all, Mr. Harlow?" Each phrase delivered with unfailing politeness but careful distance. That evening, Ethan sat in his study, pretending to read financial reports while Clara dusted the bookshelves. Her movements were graceful but tired, her shoulders slumped slightly under an invisible weight. When she reached for a high shelf, he noticed a patch on her sweater, carefully mended but visible nonetheless. Through the reflection in his computer screen, he watched her work, her eyes downcast, focused entirely on her tasks. There was something in her demeanor that spoke of deeper troubles, a sadness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Ethan found himself wondering about her story. about what circumstances had brought such a gentle soul to work in his hollow mansion, and what secrets lay behind her careful silence. The evening settled over Harlow Manor like a soft blanket, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows through the bay windows. After finishing his dinner of pot roast and vegetables, Ethan Harlow shifted uncomfortably on the plush living room couch. His weathered hands still clutched the silver-framed photograph of Margaret that he'd been holding throughout the meal. "I think I'll rest my eyes for a moment," he announced, loud enough for Clara to hear as she cleared the dinner dishes. He positioned himself carefully on the couch, making a show of yawning and settling in. But beneath his partially closed eyelids he watched intently, curious about how his new housekeeper behaved when she thought no one was looking. Clara moved quietly through the room, her sensible shoes making only the softest whispers against the hardwood floors. As she dusted the side tables, Ethan noticed how she treated each object with careful respect, as if each piece held precious memories. The silver frame slipped from his intentionally loosened grip, landing softly on the carpet beside the couch. Clara paused in her work, turning toward the sound. She approached cautiously, her movements gentle and deliberate. Kneeling beside the couch, she picked up the photograph with tender care. Ethan watched through his barely open eyes as she used the corner of her crisp white apron to wipe away a smudge on the glass, her touch as light as a feather. What happened next caught him completely off guard. Clara held the photograph for a moment, looking at Margaret's smiling face with compassionate eyes. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke, "Lord, please give Mr. Harlow peace. Help his heart heal." The simple prayer, spoken with such genuine concern, sent an unexpected wave of emotion through Ethan's chest. She placed the photograph carefully on the side table, making sure it was positioned where he could easily reach it when he woke up. Then, she retrieved a soft wool blanket from the nearby armchair. With maternal gentleness, she unfolded it and draped it over him, taking care to tuck it around his shoulders. Clara took one last look around the room, dimmed the lights slightly, and quietly left, closing the door with barely a click behind her. Only then did Ethan allow his eyes to fully open. He stared at the ceiling, stunned by what he had witnessed. The kindness in Clara's actions, the genuine care in her whispered prayer. It touched something deep within him that had been dormant for years. A smile, small but genuine, curved his lips as he settled more comfortably under the blanket she had provided. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he felt the knot of grief in his chest loosen slightly. As his eyes grew heavy with real fatigue, Ethan drifted into peaceful sleep, the gentle echoes of Clara's prayer following him into his dreams. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches of light across the polished granite countertops. Clara moved efficiently around the kitchen, her hands busy preparing breakfast as they did every morning. She nearly dropped the coffee pot when Ethan's voice broke the usual silence. "Good morning, Clara," he said warmly, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "Please, sit down and join me for coffee." Clara froze, her eyes widening with surprise. "Sir, I insist," Ethan said, taking the coffee pot from her trembling hands. "You've been here 2 weeks now, and I barely know anything about you. Let me pour you a cup." Clara hesitantly lowered herself into a chair, her posture stiff as Ethan filled 2 mugs with steaming coffee. She wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, a small grateful smile touching her lips. "How do you like working here so far?" Ethan asked, stirring cream into his coffee. "Very much, sir. The house is beautiful, and the work keeps me busy." Her voice was soft but clear. "What did you do before this?" He kept his tone gentle, not wanting to spook her. Clara took a careful sip before answering. "I worked at the Golden Valley Hotel for 5 years, and before that, several private homes." As they continued talking, Clara's shoulders gradually relaxed. When Ethan asked about her favorite foods, a genuine smile lit up her face. "My mother's chicken pot pie," she said without hesitation. "She taught me the recipe before she passed." I make it for my son Daniel on special occasions. Ethan's eyebrows rose. You have a son? Clara nodded, suddenly looking worried. Yes, he's 8. Mrs. Martinez next door watches him during my shifts. I hope that's not a problem. Not at all, Ethan assured her quickly. Children are a blessing. Something flickered in Clara's eyes at his words, a shadow of worry or pain that made Ethan wonder what she wasn't saying. But he didn't push, sensing her reluctance to share more. Later that night, Ethan sat in his study, a book open but unread in his lap. His thoughts kept drifting to breakfast, to Clara's shy smiles, and the way her whole face had softened when she spoke about her son. It had been years since he'd enjoyed simple conversation over coffee, years since he'd felt this kind of quiet pleasure in another person's company. The realization made him uneasy. He hadn't expected to find himself looking forward to these small interactions, hadn't planned on caring about Clara's story or her son's existence. His heart, long dormant after Margaret's death, stirred with unfamiliar warmth. Ethan ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his wedding ring. Could his heart, scarred by loss and hardened by loneliness, truly be capable of healing? The question haunted him as he stared into the darkness beyond his study window. Ethan's silver Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway of his mansion on a warm afternoon. The business lunch had gone well, but his mind was already drifting to the comfort of his study and perhaps a brief chat with Clara, who had become a gentle presence in his daily routine. As he entered through the grand front door, unusual sounds caught his attention, the soft murmur of Clara's voice and what seemed like a child's whisper. Following the noise, he rounded the corner to find Clara in the foyer, her hands resting protectively on the shoulders of a small boy with wide brown eyes and tousled dark hair. Mr. Harlow, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. This is my son, Daniel. The neighbor who usually watches him had an emergency, and I had nowhere else. Daniel peered up at Ethan shyly, partially hiding behind his mother's skirt. He was a delicate-looking child of about 7 years old, with Clara's gentle features and warm brown eyes. Hello, Daniel, Ethan said kindly, trying to ease the obvious tension. His 2 golden retrievers, Max and Bear, padded over to investigate the newcomer, their tails wagging in friendly curiosity. Daniel's eyes lit up at the sight of the dogs. Can I pet them? He asked softly. Of course, Ethan replied, watching as the boy cautiously reached out to stroke Max's golden fur. The dog responded with an enthusiastic lick to Daniel's face, drawing out a delighted giggle. As Daniel grew more comfortable, his attention wandered to the antique chess set displayed on a side table in the foyer. Do you play chess? He asked Ethan, his earlier shyness melting away. I do. Would you like to see the pieces? Ethan bent down to the boy's level, holding out his hand in greeting. I'm Ethan. Daniel stepped forward, and instead of shaking Ethan's hand, he leaned in close, his small voice barely a whisper. Mommy says you're my daddy. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He straightened up sharply, his mind reeling as he looked at Clara, who had gone deathly pale. Mr. Harlow, please, I can explain, Clara began, reaching for him with trembling hands. I never meant to, but Ethan was already backing away, his world tilting on its axis. Without a word, he turned and strode quickly down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He didn't stop until he reached his bedroom. Slamming the door behind him, sitting heavily on the edge of his bed, Ethan stared unseeing at the wall. Daniel's innocent face kept appearing in his mind, those familiar brown eyes that now held a different meaning. The confusion and sense of betrayal churned in his stomach as he tried to make sense of this earth-shattering revelation. The morning sun filtered through the study's heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the antique Persian rug. Ethan sat at his mahogany desk, mechanically sorting through papers while his mind replayed yesterday's shocking revelation. The gentle knock at the door made his shoulders tense. Come in, he said gruffly. Though he knew who it would be, Clara entered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her simple blue dress. Her face was pale, and her eyes were already glistening with unshed tears. She had just returned from dropping Daniel off at school, and the weight of what she needed to say seemed to press her shoulders down. "Mr. Harlow," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to explain about Daniel, about everything." Ethan set down his papers, but didn't look at her directly. "Yes, I believe you do." Clara took a shaky breath. 7 years ago, I worked as a waitress at the Golden Pine Hotel. You were staying there after," she hesitated, "after your wife passed. You were so lost in grief, drinking alone at the bar every night." Ethan's hand clenched into a fist as fragments of memory stirred. That dark period when he'd tried to drown his sorrow in expensive whiskey. "One night we talked. You were kind to me, vulnerable in a way that touched my heart. We shared one night together," Clara's voice cracked. "When I found out I was pregnant weeks later, I couldn't bring myself to tell you. You were already dealing with so much pain, and I was just a waitress. I feared you'd think I was trying to trap you, or that I'd be another burden in your life." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now. "I never meant to deceive you. Taking this job, it wasn't some scheme, I promise. I've been working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just trying to give Daniel a good life. When I saw the cleaning position advertised here, I knew it paid better than my other work. I told myself it would be okay, that you'd never have to know." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "But Daniel, he's so smart, so observant. He figured it out somehow, just from the little things I've said about his father over the years. I never meant for him to tell you like that." Ethan finally looked at her, his face a storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, and something else, a stirring of responsibility he couldn't ignore. "Leave," he said, his voice rough. I need time alone." Clara nodded, her shoulders slumping even further as she turned toward the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, as if wanting to say more, but then silently left the room. Alone, Ethan reached for the silver-framed photograph of his late wife that always sat on his desk. His fingers gripped the frame so tightly, his knuckles turned white as guilt and disbelief warred within him. How could he have forgotten that night? How could he have a son he never knew about? The weight of these revelations pressed down on him like a physical force as he stared into his late wife's smiling face, seeking answers that wouldn't come. The morning sunlight streamed through Ethan's study window, carrying with it the unexpected sound of laughter, bright, genuine, and childlike. It had been so long since such a joyful sound had echoed through his property that it pulled him from his paperwork like a magnet. Rising from his desk, he moved to the window. There in his manicured garden, Daniel was playing fetch with his 2 golden retrievers, Max and Bailey. The dogs bounded after a worn tennis ball, their tails wagging with excitement as Daniel's clear laughter rang out across the lawn. The sight stirred something in Ethan's chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Roy's dark hair caught the sunlight as he threw the ball again, his small face lit up with pure delight. The dogs seemed gentler with him than they'd ever been with anyone else, carefully taking the ball from his tiny hands instead of their usual enthusiastic grabbing. After watching for several minutes, Ethan found himself walking outside, drawn by the scene before him. Daniel noticed him and waved shyly, his earlier carefree expression becoming more hesitant. "Good morning, Mr. Harlow," he said politely, clutching the tennis ball. "I hope it's okay that I'm playing with your dogs." "It's fine," Ethan replied, his voice softer than usual. He watched as Daniel's eyes drifted to the chess set visible through the study window. "Do you?" Daniel started, then stopped, scuffing his shoe in the grass. "Do you think you could teach me how to play chess? Mom says you're really good." Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. Chess had always been his private refuge. But something in the boy's hopeful expression made him pause. After a long moment, he nodded. "Come inside then." They settled at the chess table, and Clara appeared in the doorway, watching silently as Ethan began explaining the pieces. Her eyes held a complex mixture of hope and fear as she observed them together. "This is the pawn," Ethan explained, holding up the small piece. "It can only move forward, one square at a time. Except for its first move, then it can move 2 squares if you want." Daniel leaned forward, his brown eyes focused intently on each piece as Ethan demonstrated their movements. His eagerness to learn, the careful way he handled each piece, stirred something deep and forgotten in Ethan's heart. Something paternal, he thought, had died years ago. They played a simple game, Ethan patiently explaining strategies and helping Daniel understand the rules. The boy's face lit up with each successful move, and Ethan found himself genuinely enjoying the teaching process. As they finished their game, Daniel carefully placed his king down in defeat, but his smile remained bright. Looking up at Ethan with those innocent eyes, he said softly, "Thanks, Dad." The words hung in the air between them. Ethan's heart clenched, but he didn't correct the boy. Instead, he sat there in silence, aware of Clara's quiet presence in the doorway, as the morning sun continued to stream through the windows. Later that evening, the kitchen took on a different atmosphere as Ethan and Clara sat across from each other at the small servants' table. Steam rose from their teacups, creating a gentle veil between them that somehow made it easier to speak freely. The usual barriers of employer and employee seemed to dissolve in the warm glow of the overhead light. "Tell me about your life, Clara," Ethan said softly, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "The real story, not just what you put on your job application." Clara's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "After Daniel was born, I worked 3 jobs, waitressing in the morning, cleaning houses in the afternoon, and night shifts at a convenience store. My neighbor watched Daniel, but I could see the judgment in her eyes, just like everyone else's. How did you manage?" Ethan leaned forward, genuinely curious. "One day at a time," Clara replied, a small smile touching her lips. "Daniel gave me strength. When people whispered about the single mother with no husband, I just held my head up and kept going. He needed me to be strong." Ethan nodded, understanding flooding his features. "After Margaret passed," he began, his voice catching slightly, "I thought being strong meant shutting everything out. Everyone out. I was wrong." He paused, taking a sip of tea to steady himself. "I regret so much now, the birthdays I missed with Grace, the holidays I spent alone in my office. I thought I was protecting myself from more pain, but I was just making it worse." Clara's eyes softened with compassion. "Grief does strange things to us," she said gently. "We all cope differently." "Yes, but some of us cope badly," Ethan replied with a self-deprecating laugh. "I built walls so high I couldn't even see over them anymore. Until," he trailed off, looking at her meaningfully. The kitchen fell quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the clock and the occasional clink of teacups against saucers. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with understanding, with walls crumbling between them. Later that night, Ethan lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The conversation with Clara kept playing in his mind, her quiet strength, her dignity in the face of hardship, the way she spoke of Daniel with such love. He thought about his massive house with its empty rooms and hollow silence. Then he thought about Daniel's laughter in the garden, about Clara's gentle presence making every space feel warmer, more alive. In the darkness, a realization washed over him. He wanted to give them the home they deserved. Not just a place to live, but a real home with love, security, and family. The thought both terrified and excited him, keeping him wide awake as the night hours ticked by. He turned onto his side, his mind full of possibilities he'd never dared to consider before. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years felt different. Now, less like a shield and more like a barrier he was finally ready to break down. The kitchen filled with the warm aroma of pancakes and bacon as Clara moved gracefully between the stove and counter that Saturday morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the steam that rose from the griddle. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, his legs swinging excitedly as he watched his mother cook. When Ethan's footsteps echoed in the hallway, Daniel's face lit up. "Dad, come have breakfast with us," he called out eagerly before Clara could say anything. Ethan paused in the doorway, touched by the boy's enthusiasm. The morning light softened his usually stern features as he took in the domestic scene before him. Clara glanced over her shoulder, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Please join us," she said softly, flipping another golden pancake onto a growing stack. The mansion, which had known only echoing silence for so many years, now rang with Daniel's delighted giggles as Ethan told him funny stories over breakfast. Clara couldn't help but smile as she watched them together, father and son forming a bond that seemed to grow stronger by the day. After breakfast, Ethan suggested they visit the local park. Daniel bounced with excitement as they walked the tree-lined paths, his small hand tucked trustingly in Ethan's larger one. At the ice cream cart, Ethan bought Daniel a double scoop of chocolate, carefully wiping drips from the boy's chin as Clara looked on with tender amusement. They settled on a park bench, where Ethan began sharing stories from his youth, tales of climbing trees, building forts, and getting into harmless mischief with his childhood friends. Daniel listened with wide-eyed wonder, while Clara found herself drawn into these glimpses of a younger, more carefree Ethan. Something had changed in Ethan. The weight of loneliness that had pressed down on him for so long seemed to lift. As he watched Daniel chase butterflies and Clara laugh at their antics, he felt truly alive again. This, he realized, was what it meant to be a father and husband, not just in name, but in heart. That evening after Daniel had gone to bed, Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway watching Clara at the sink. Her hands moved methodically through the soapy water as she hummed a gentle tune. The soft melody filled the kitchen with a peace he hadn't known in years. Looking at her silhouetted against the window, her movements graceful in the fading light, Ethan felt his heart swell with emotion. "Maybe," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the sound of running water, "God is giving me a second chance." The following Monday morning, Ethan gathered Clara and Daniel in the mansion's cozy living room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the polished hardwood floors. Daniel sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, while Clara perched nervously on the edge of an armchair. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his voice gentle but firm. "This house is too big for just me, and the guest wing is sitting empty. I'd like you both to move in permanently." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Harlow, we couldn't possibly." "Please," Ethan interrupted softly. "Call me Ethan, and I mean it. The guest wing has its own entrance, kitchen, and living space. You'd have privacy, but you'd also be here, with me." His eyes held a warmth that made Clara pause. She looked at Daniel, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Could we really live here, Mom? With the dogs in the big yard and everything?" Ethan knelt down to Daniel's level. "I could teach you to play the piano properly. That old grand piano in the music room needs someone to bring it back to life." Clara watched them together, seeing the genuine affection in Ethan's eyes. Her hesitation melted away. "If you're sure, I've never been more sure of anything," Ethan replied. Within days, the mansion transformed. The guest wing, once silent and dusty, came alive with Daniel's laughter and Clara's gentle presence. Each morning, Ethan and Daniel spent an hour at the piano, the boy's small fingers learning to dance across the keys while Ethan patiently guided him through scales and simple melodies. Clara discovered the overgrown garden behind the house and spent her free hours coaxing it back to life. Roses began to bloom again, and fresh herbs sprouted in neat rows. She often looked up from her gardening to see Ethan watching her from his study window, a soft smile on his face. Their evenings centered around the dining room table, now filled with conversation and warmth. Daniel chatted about school, Clara shared stories from her day, And Ethan found himself laughing more than he had in years. One afternoon, while Daniel practiced piano and Clara tended to her garden, Ethan made a quiet phone call to his lawyer. "I need to make an addition to my will," he said, his voice firm. "Regarding my son, Daniel." The words felt right as he spoke them. That evening, after dinner and stories and tucking Daniel into his new bed, Ethan sat in his study. The lamp cast a warm glow as he opened his leather-bound journal and began to write. Perhaps redemption is not found in solitude, but in the gift of unexpected love. The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the colorful leaves as a sleek, black car pulled up to the mansion's circular driveway. Grace Harlow, now 35, stepped out, her designer boots crunching on fallen leaves. Her face was set in determination as she approached the grand entrance of her childhood home. Just as she reached for the doorbell, laughter echoed from inside, a child's gleeful sound that made her pause. Confused, she pressed the bell. Footsteps approached, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a woman Grace had never seen before. "Oh, hello," Clara said warmly. "May I help you?" Grace's eyes narrowed. "I'm Grace Harlow. This is my father's house. Who are you?" Before Clara could answer, Daniel came running down the hallway. "Mom, Dad says we can have pizza for dinner." He stopped short at the sight of the stranger. Grace's face went pale. "Dad," she whispered, then pushed past Clara into the foyer. Father, where are you?" Ethan emerged from his study, his face registering shock. "Grace? I wasn't expecting." "Clearly not," Grace cut him off, her voice sharp. "Would you care to explain why there's a woman and child calling you Dad in Mom's house?" Clara instinctively moved toward Daniel, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. The boy sensed the tension and pressed closer to his mother. "Grace, please," Ethan began. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Grace's voice rose. "How you've let some opportunist move in and take over. How you've dishonored Mom's memory." She turned to Clara, eyes blazing. "How long did it take you to manipulate your way in here?" Daniel, frightened by the angry words, broke away and ran upstairs to his room. Clara called after him, but stayed rooted in place, her face flushing with humiliation. "That's enough," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. He glanced between his daughter and Clara, torn between defending his new family and placating his firstborn. "I should check on Daniel," Clara whispered, turning away as tears threatened to fall. "Father, how could you?" Grace demanded. "Mom's only been gone 5 years, and you've replaced her with a maid?" Ethan's silence spoke volumes. Clara, who had paused on the stairs, felt her heart break at his inability to defend her. Without another word, she climbed the rest of the way up, her shoulders slumped in defeat. That night, after Grace had left and the house had grown quiet, Clara packed their belongings with trembling hands. Daniel slept fitfully in his bed, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. She wrote a simple note. "I'm sorry. We never meant to hurt anyone." As dawn painted the sky in soft pink hues, Clara and Daniel slipped out of the mansion. A taxi waited at the end of the driveway, its exhaust creating misty swirls in the cool morning air. From his study window, Ethan watched helplessly as the two people who had brought warmth back into his life climbed into the taxi and disappeared. Down the long driveway, leaving only silence in their wake, the mansion felt like a tomb again. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each sound a reminder of what he'd lost. The space that had briefly been filled with Daniel's gleeful laughter and Clara's gentle humming now pressed in on him with suffocating silence. He paused by Daniel's room, where the chess set still sat exactly as they'd left it during their last game. The night lay toppled on its side, and Ethan couldn't bring himself to right it. Even the dogs seemed subdued, lying listlessly in patches of sunlight, missing the little boy who had brought such energy to their days. "Dad?" Grace's voice carried from the doorway. She stood there, carefully styled and poised as always, but uncertainty flickered across her face. "I made some coffee. Would you like to sit with me?" Ethan turned away, his shoulders stiff. "I have work to do, please," Grace said, taking a step forward. "I know you're upset, but I was only trying to protect you." That woman, Ethan cut in, his voice ice cold, "showed more genuine care for me in a few months than I've seen from anyone in years." He remembered Clara's whispered prayer that night when she thought he was sleeping, the gentle way she'd touched his late wife's photograph. There had been no calculation there, no hidden agenda, just pure compassion. Grace flinched. "You can't mean that." "After everything we've been through, what we've been through," Ethan said, "is years of distance that we both created. And when I finally found a chance at happiness again, you destroyed it with your judgment and accusations." He walked past her, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. His feet carried him to the study, where Daniel's small wooden chair still sat pulled up to the chess table. Ethan sank heavily into his seat across from the empty space. The afternoon light caught the polished chess pieces, making them gleam. Daniel had been so proud when he'd learned how each piece moved, his face lighting up with each small victory. Clara would stand in the doorway sometimes, watching them with such tender hope in her eyes. Ethan's vision blurred as tears welled up and spilled down his cheeks. His fingers traced the edge of the chessboard as the weight of loss pressed against his chest. "I can't lose them too," he whispered, his voice breaking in the empty room. The morning sun had barely risen when Ethan burst through his front door, his heart pounding with urgency. "James," he called to his driver, who stood by the black town car. "We need to find Clara's apartment immediately." As they drove through the quiet streets, Ethan's hands twisted nervously in his lap. He'd gotten Clara's address from the employment paperwork, leading them to a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The building's faded brick exterior and rusted fire escapes told the story of working-class struggles he'd been. Blind to most of his life, that an elderly woman was watering plants on her small balcony when Ethan approached. "Excuse me," he called up. "I'm looking for Clara Thompson's apartment." The woman's eyes narrowed with recognition. "Oh, you must be the fancy man she worked for." Her voice carried a mix of judgment and pity. "You're too late." She was up half the night packing. Ethan's heart dropped. "Packing?" Said she needed a fresh start somewhere new. "Poor thing's been through enough." The neighbor shook her head. "She and that sweet boy of hers deserve better than all the gossip and hard times they've had here. When did they leave?" Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. "Not 20 minutes ago." Headed to the bus station downtown, the woman's expression softened slightly. "She was crying when she left, you know." Never seen Clara cry before, not through all her troubles. Ethan spun around, racing back to the car. "James, the bus station, quickly!" As they weaved through morning traffic, Ethan's mind raced with all the things he needed to say, all the ways he'd failed to defend them when it mattered most. He couldn't let them disappear forever. He couldn't lose this chance at happiness, at family, because of his own cowardice. The car had barely stopped at the station entrance when Ethan leaped out, scanning the crowded terminal frantically. Then he spotted them, Clara in her worn blue coat, holding Daniel's small hand as they stood in line, tickets clutched tightly in her other hand. The destination board above them showed the next departure. Interstate Bus 247, departing for Michigan, 8:15 a.m. Through the bustling station, Ethan pushed his way toward the ticket counter line where Clara and Daniel stood. The morning crowd parted around him as he moved with determined steps. When Clara spotted him, she immediately looked down at her worn shoes, shame coloring her cheeks. "Clara, please," Ethan called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Don't leave." Several travelers turned to watch as Ethan approached them. He didn't care about the audience. His focus was solely on the two people who had brought light back into his empty mansion and his lonely heart. "I've been such a fool," he said, his voice thick with regret. I let my pride and my fear of what others might think stop me from embracing what matters most. He swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I was afraid of opening my heart again, afraid of being judged for loving you both. Clara's hands trembled as she held their tickets, tears welling in her eyes. Daniel looked between them, still clutching his chess piece. Ethan knelt down on the hard station floor, bringing himself eye level with his son. "Daniel," he said softly, "I want to be the father you deserve. The father I should have been from the start. Will you give me that chance?" Daniel didn't hesitate. He launched himself into Ethan's arms, hugging him fiercely. "I already knew you were. Dad," he whispered against Ethan's shoulder. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to stifle her sobs as she watched them embrace. Near the station entrance, Grace stood motionless, her confrontational words dying on her lips as she witnessed the raw sincerity of the moment between father and son. Outside the bus station, the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Ethan gently guided Clara and Daniel away from the terminal entrance. Clara held Daniel's small hand tightly, her other arm wrapped around their worn suitcase. "Please come home," Ethan said softly. "The mansion isn't the same without you both." Before Clara could respond, footsteps approached from behind them. Grace stood there, her face a storm of emotions. Her perfectly styled hair and designer outfit couldn't hide the conflict in her eyes. "Wait," Grace called out, her voice wavering. She took a deep breath and stepped closer. I was wrong." Clara instinctively pulled Daniel closer, but the boy watched Grace with curious eyes. "I've been so afraid," Grace continued, tears welling up. "Afraid that if Dad had a new family, he wouldn't have room in his heart for me anymore. That I'd lose what little of him I had left after Mom died." "Oh, Grace," Clara said gently, "I never wanted to replace your mother, or take your father away from you. I just," she glanced down at Daniel, "wanted my son to know his father." Grace nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. "I see that now. The way Dad looks at both of you, it's not what I thought. It's real." She turned her attention to Daniel, who still watched her intently. After a moment's hesitation, Grace extended her hand toward him. "Hi, Daniel. I'm your big sister. If you'd like that?" Daniel's face broke into a radiant smile. Instead of taking her hand, he rushed forward and hugged her around the waist. "I always wanted a sister." Grace's surprise melted into a tearful laugh as she hugged him back. Ethan's driver pulled up in the sleek black car, and they all climbed in together, Ethan and Clara in the back seat with Daniel between them, Grace sitting up front. As they drove toward the mansion, a delicate peace settled over them. Not perfect, still fragile, but full of hope. Daniel chattered happily about showing Grace his chess pieces, while she listened with genuine interest. Clara's hand found Ethan's across the back of Daniel's seat, and he squeezed it gently. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming them all as they headed home together. Laughter echoed through the mansion's halls, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar over the past few weeks. The grand old house seemed to have awakened from a long slumber, its rooms warmed by the presence of family and love. Grace's car pulled into the circular driveway every Wednesday and Sunday without fail, her art supplies tucked under one arm and a fresh batch of cookies in the other. Daniel would race to greet her, eager to show off his latest drawings or tell her about his improving grades at school. His teacher had noted his remarkable progress, commenting on his newfound confidence and enthusiasm for learning. Clara, no longer wearing her maid's uniform, moved through the house with grace and dignity. She'd started taking online business classes in the evenings, supported wholeheartedly by Ethan, who insisted on creating a proper study space for her in the library. On this particular Sunday evening, the dining room glowed with soft candlelight. Ethan had arranged a special dinner, the table set with his finest china and crystal glasses that caught the light like diamonds. The aroma of roast chicken and fresh-baked bread filled the air as they gathered. Around the table, Daniel bounced in his seat between Grace and Clara, while Ethan stood at the head of the table, raising his glass. His eyes were misty as he looked at the faces of his unexpected family. "Before we begin," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to make a toast." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Love lost is never love wasted, and love found again is grace beyond measure. Clara reached for his free hand, squeezing it gently. Grace wiped a tear from her cheek, smiling at her father with understanding and acceptance. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and stories shared, Ethan led Daniel up to bed. The boys' room, once a stark guest room, now burst with color, his drawings proudly displayed on the walls alongside Grace's art lessons. Ethan tucked the covers around his son, then knelt beside the bed. "Dear Lord," he whispered, "thank you for this precious gift of family, for second chances and open hearts." From the doorway, Clara watched silently, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. As Ethan rose and turned toward her, she saw in his face what she felt in her own heart: complete wholeness, a sense of belonging that neither had dared hope for before. The mansion, once so empty, now overflowed with faith, forgiveness, and everlasting love. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.